the lock stuck for half a second before it gave, the way it always did in August when the woods swelled with the river damp, and that half a second was the last one in my life I didn't know. I had a box of 6 macarons balanced on my palm, pistachio and rose, because those were the only 2 flavors Priya had ever finished without picking at. And I had a bottle of the cheap sparkling wine we'd bought on our first anniversary because we were young then and thought irony was romantic. 5 years. 1,825 days, though I hadn't counted until that morning, standing in the bakery line rehearsing what I'd say. I climbed the stairs, still rehearsing. I opened the door, still rehearsing. The sound stopped me on the 3rd stair before my eyes caught up to my ears. I have gone back to that stair more times than I can count, trying to locate the exact moment the marriage ended, and I have decided it was there, on the wood, before I ever saw anything at all. Sound arrives faster than understanding. My body knew before I did. My hand went cold around the macaron box. My throat closed around the words I'd practiced. And then I was in the doorway, and there was no more rehearsing anything, because my wife was under my sister, and my sister had her mouth against the mark on Priya's throat where a bonding bite should have been, and never was, and neither of them heard the box hit the floor. Pistachio, rose, 6 macarons on hardwood, one still spinning on its edge like it hadn't decided whether the world could possibly be this ordinary and this ruined at the same time. Ren, Priya said my name, like an apology that wasn't going to arrive. My sister said nothing at all, which told me everything, because Dahlia had never in her life been at a loss for words except when she was guilty of something too large to talk her way around. I want to tell you I screamed. I didn't. I want to tell you I threw something, that I became, for one clean cinematic minute, a woman with the right to be furious. What I actually did was pick up the unspilled bottle of sparkling wine, set it gently on the dresser like it might still be needed for something, and walk out of the bedroom I had slept in for 5 years to sit on the edge of the bathtub with the door locked. Because some animal part of me needed 4 walls and a lock between myself and the sound of them realizing what they'd done. I was 32 years old, and no one in that house had ever once looked at me and seen anything but useful. Not Priya, who married me because the Ashford-Vane merger needed a quiet Omega wife who wouldn't ask questions about the family accounts, and certainly not Dahlia, who had spent our whole childhood watching me get chosen for the things she wanted and deciding, apparently, that Priya belonged on that list. I had built a life out of being the person no one worried about. I kept the ledgers. I kept the peace. I kept my head down over columns of numbers until I could make anomalies confess things people hadn't meant to say out loud, a skill so unglamorous that even I forgot, some mornings, that it was a gift and not a chore. I had found $400,000 of misfiled inventory for a supplier once, sitting at my own kitchen table with a laptop and a cold cup of tea, and Priya had said, distracted, "That's nice, Rennie," without looking up from her phone. She had never marked me. 5 years married, and there was no bite scar on my throat, because she said the modern thing was to wait, to be sure. To not rush biology into a decision the heart should make freely, and I had believed her, because belief was easier than the alternative, which was noticing that a woman does not withhold a bond from someone she intends to keep. By the time I came out of the bathroom, Dahlia was gone, and Priya was sitting on the end of the bed in a robe, dry-eyed, already rehearsing her own speech the way I had rehearsed mine on the stairs. She started with logistics. That was the tell. Not sorry. Logistics. We should talk about the house, she said. We should, I agreed, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. Steady the way numbers are steady, the way a column adds up whether or not you want it to. Tonight, she looked almost relieved. I understood, later, that she had been afraid of a scene, a slammed door, lawyers with teeth. She had not been afraid of me being calm. Nobody who has spent 5 years deciding I was harmless is ever afraid of my calm. I signed everything that night. The house, my shares in the Ashford Vane Holding Company, held jointly since the wedding as a tax convenience neither of us had ever expected to matter. The car. The joint accounts. I signed with a cheap brass pen from the Amara Hotel, a joke gift from our honeymoon that had lived in the bottom of my bag for 5 years because I never remembered to throw it away, and it felt correct, somehow, that the pen that had signed our marriage license in spirit, we'd used it to sign the guest book, laughing, 27 years old and certain of everything, should be the one to sign it all back into nothing. Priya's lawyer, summoned at 11 at night with the particular efficiency of a man who has clearly done this before for this family, slid the papers across the table, one at a time. I read every line. That was the one thing I did for myself. I read every single line. Because numbers do not lie to people who know how to ask them the right questions, and some small cold part of me that would matter enormously later was already looking for the shape of something wrong. I found nothing that night. I was tired and grieving and looking with the wrong kind of attention. I would come back to those documents in 4 months with sharper eyes and find the thing that had been sitting in them all along, waiting. At 2 a.m, I put a duffel bag in the back of a cab with $1,100 in checking, a laptop, and no plan beyond a way. The driver asked where to. I gave him the name of a shelter I'd once done pro bono books for, a place called the Ferry House that took in omegas between lives, because it was the only address in the city that had never once made me feel like a guest in someone else's world. I didn't cry until the cab crossed the river. Then I put my hand over my mouth so the driver wouldn't hear, and I watched the lights of the house I'd signed away shrink to nothing in the side mirror. And some very small, very stubborn voice at the bottom of my chest said, "You are going to be fine, Wren Calloway, because you have always been the one who counts things correctly, even when no one else is counting at all." I did not yet know the name Vesper Cade. I would learn it in 11 days, standing in a lobby with marble floors that cost more than the house I'd just given away, holding a folder full of numbers that didn't add up, about to walk into the one room in the city that could end my sister and my ex-wife both. And I had no idea, none, that the woman behind that door had been quietly waiting 3 years for someone to walk in and prove that love could still be a fact, instead of a bet she'd already lost once. The Ferry House gave me a cot and a locker and, more importantly, a bulletin board with index cards pinned to it advertising odd work for cash, dog walking, tutoring, one card from a woman needing her late mother's estate sorted before probate closed. I took every card that involved numbers, because numbers were the only language I trusted not to lie to me twice in 1 month. On the 9th day, sorting the estate for the woman on Larchmont Street, I found something that had nothing to do with her mother's will and everything to do with a name I recognized from the society pages taped to the Ferry House break room wall, because the residents liked to look at people richer and unhappier than themselves. Cade Holdings, a single-line item, a shipping manifest routed through a textile vendor, misfiled under a code that didn't match anything else in the ledger. I knew that vendor code. I had typed it myself 100 times, doing the Ashford Vane books at my own kitchen table. Vane Textiles was a supplier to Cade Holdings, and somebody inside Vane Textiles was skimming freight allocations in amounts small enough to hide and steady enough to matter. A pattern I recognized the way you recognize a stranger's handshake as familiar half a second before you remember the face. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself that for about 6 hours, sitting on the cot with the number pattern glowing behind my eyes like a held note. Then I put on the one blazer I owned that didn't look like it had been slept in, because it had, and I took the ledger printout to the only address a stranger's business card had given me for Cade Holdings, 41 floors up, security in the lobby. A receptionist who looked at my resume less folder like it might be a threat. "I need to speak to someone in finance about vendor fraud," I said. "I have documentation. Do you have an appointment?" "No, I have proof." I don't know what made her buzz me through instead of calling security. Maybe it was the specific way I said proof, flat, unafraid, the tone of someone who has stopped being frightened of being wrong because she has spent a lifetime being right about the wrong things. I was walked into a glass conference room on the 38th floor and told to wait, and I waited 40 minutes among people who kept glancing at my blazer like it had a stain, before the door opened and the room went quieter than a room full of executives has any business going. She was tall in the specific way that makes rooms rearrange themselves, dressed in charcoal that had clearly never once wrinkled from wear, and she smelled. I noticed it before I noticed her face, because scent always finds me first, of vetiver and struck flint. Something cold and lit at the same time, like weather about to break. Every alpha in that room deferred to her, without seeming to decide to. She sat down across from me without introducing herself. Because she didn't need to. I had seen her photograph once, taped under a headline that called her the Winter Widow of Cade Tower, a woman who had buried a wife 3 years ago, and buried, along with her, apparently, every soft thing she used to be. "You said you have proof of fraud," she said. Not a question. Her voice had the register of someone who had stopped phrasing things as questions a long time ago. "I do." I slid the printout across the table, my hands steadier than they had any right to be. "Your vendor, Vane Textiles, has been misallocating freight costs for at least 14 months. The code they're hiding it under is one I recognize, because I used to do the books for the family that owns Vane. I'm not guessing. I can show you exactly where it started and exactly how much." She read the page in silence long enough that 2 of her executives began to look nervous on her behalf. Then she looked up, and her eyes did something I would spend the next several months learning to read, a very small recalibration. The look of someone encountering a fact she had not expected and deciding instantly that it mattered more than her schedule. "What's your name?" "Wren Calloway." "Who do you work for?" "Miss Calloway, no one." "Currently, then you walked in off the street with a 14-month audit trail nobody in my finance department caught. They weren't looking at it the way I was looking at it. I met her eyes, because looking away has never once fixed a number that was wrong. Most fraud isn't clever. It's just boring enough that nobody reads the whole page. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved through the room like weather. "Odera," she said, without turning her head, and a broad-shouldered woman by the door straightened. "Get finance in here. All of them, and get Miss Calloway a contract before she walks back out that door and does this for someone else." That was how I met Vesper Cade, not across a ballroom, not through an arranged introduction, but across a conference table with a fraud trail between us, the only currency I had ever been fluent in. I signed a consulting contract 2 hours later at a desk on the 40th floor in a building tall enough that the river I'd cried over 11 days before looked, from up there, like a thread someone had dropped and forgotten to pick up. By the end of that first week, I had a temporary badge, a locked office with my name misspelled on the doorplate, and a growing, uneasy certainty that the fraud trail led somewhere I did not want it to lead. By the end of the second week, Odera Voss, Vesper's chief of security, a gruff former military beta who called everyone by their surname, and had made it clear on day one that she trusted numbers people exactly as far as she could see them, stopped by my office to drop off a set of vendor contracts and said, gruffer than she probably meant to, "Boss doesn't do that for people." Contract on the spot. 15 years I've worked for her. I've never once seen her make a decision that fast that wasn't about money. Maybe it was about money, I said. Odera looked at me the particular way people look at something they've decided to reserve judgment on. Maybe, she said, and left it there, which from her, I would learn, was practically a blessing. The apartment came without my asking for it, a small furnished unit 2 floors below Vesper's own penthouse, in the same building for security reasons. Given the nature of the audit, Odera said, deadpan enough that I couldn't tell if she believed it either. I told myself it was a business decision. I unpacked my duffel bag onto a queen bed that had never held anyone's grief but mine, and on the 3rd night, unable to sleep, I went up to the rooftop garden because the building directory listed it as accessible to residents and found Vesper Cade already there, alone, sitting very still with a glass of something amber and untouched, looking at the city like it owed her an answer it kept refusing to give. "Can't sleep, Miss Calloway Wren," I said. And no, Vesper, she didn't look at me when she said it, which somehow made it feel more offered than if she had. The numbers keeping you up, or the wife. I hadn't told her about Priya. I hadn't told anyone at Cade Holdings anything about my life before the audit trail. How do you know about the wife? I read the intake file Odera runs on every new hire who has this kind of access. Divorce finalized 11 days ago. Full asset surrender, no contest. A pause, weighed carefully, like she was deciding whether the next sentence was hers to say. That's not a divorce. That's a surrender. It was easier. Easier isn't the same as right. She finally looked at me, and in the low garden light her scent seemed to sharpen, cold water over warm stone. Whatever you find in those vein files, Wren, bring it to me first. Before the board, before legal, before anyone. I will believe you before anyone else does. I need you to know that, because I suspect nobody has told you that in longer than you'd like to admit. I didn't have an answer for that. I went back down to my apartment 2 floors below hers and lay awake a long time, not because I couldn't sleep anymore, but because something in my chest had loosened 1/2 inch for the first time in 11 days, and I didn't yet have a name for what had done it. The wealth gap announced itself before anyone bothered to explain it to me. My apartment had thread count sheets I had to look up to understand. The penthouse had floors so quiet I understood, walking them. That quiet itself was something money bought. Vesper's assistant, a sharp young alpha named Pharaoh, looked at my 2 blazers with an expression he tried and failed to keep neutral until the day I corrected a projection error in a live meeting that would have cost the company $11 million in a bad shipping contract. And after that, Pharaoh brought me coffee unasked and stopped commenting on my blazers at all. Vesper noticed things. That was the part that undid me slowly, over weeks, more than any grand gesture could have. I mentioned once, in passing, exhausted at midnight over spreadsheets, that my mother used to make burnt-edge toast with orange marmalade when I was small and sick, that it was the only thing my stomach ever trusted. 4 days later, the penthouse kitchen had a jar of orange marmalade in it that hadn't been there before, and toast came up slightly too dark, exactly the way I liked it, and nobody ever mentioned that it had been arranged. I hummed Claire de Lune under my breath sometimes without noticing I was doing it, a habit from childhood piano lessons. I caught Vesper once humming 4 bars of it back to herself while reviewing a contract, and she stopped the second she saw me notice. The way you stop doing something you didn't know you'd started. You remember things, I said. I remember things that matter. She didn't look up from the contract. It isn't a skill. It's just where I choose to put my attention. That was the closest she came, in those early weeks, to admitting anything at all. The rumors filled in what she wouldn't, that the winter widow had buried a wife named Elena 3 years ago after a long illness, that she had not been seen at a social function since, that her mother, the formidable Ilsa Cade, had raised her on the doctrine that Cade women do not need saving, they do the saving, and that whatever softness Vesper Cade had once possessed had gone into the ground with Elena and never come back up. I didn't believe that last part. I'd seen the marmalade. The first charged touch came on an ordinary Tuesday, over ordinary paperwork, when I reached for a folder at the same moment she did, and her hand closed briefly over mine on the desk, warm despite the cold scent that clung to her. And neither of us moved for 4 full seconds before she withdrew it like she'd touched something that might burn her on principle rather than fact. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be." The words came out before I'd finished deciding to say them. She looked at me a long moment, something unguarded flickering under the control, before the control came back down over it like a shutter. "The vain audit," she said instead. "All business again." "How close are you?" "Close." I hesitated, because the shape of what I'd found in the last week had started to feel less like fraud and more like something aimed at me specifically, though I couldn't yet say how. "There's a name on some of the internal transfer approvals I need you to see. I want to be sure before I show you, because if I'm right, it isn't just vain skimming freight costs. It's bigger, and it's uglier, and one of the names attached to it is going to matter to me personally." "Then be sure," Vesper said, "and when you are, bring it to me first." I meant that the first time I said it. 4 days later, I was sure. The transfer approvals routed not just through Vane Textiles' general accounts, but through a shell entity registered 18 months ago, under a name I recognized instantly, because I'd watched her sign it into being over drinks once, laughing, calling it her someday fund, D. Calloway Holdings, my sister's name, on a shell company built to receive skimmed freight allocations from my ex-wife's family business, money that had been quietly bleeding out of Vane Textiles, and, by extension, out of every contract Vane held with Cade Holdings, for at least 18 months. 18 months. Longer than I had known about the affair, which meant the affair and the theft had started together, or the theft had started first, and I did not yet know which of those was worse. I brought the file to Vesper's office at 9 that night, my hands steady out of long habit and nothing else, and set it on her desk without preamble. "The shell company belongs to my sister," I said. "The skimmed funds have been moving through it for 18 months. My ex-wife's signature authorizes the transfers on the Vane side every single time." I made myself say the next part plainly, because plain was the only way I knew how to survive it. They didn't just betray my marriage. They built a theft on top of it and let me carry the paperwork trail without knowing what I was carrying. Some of these authorizations are dated during periods I was doing the home books. If anyone goes looking without context, my handwriting is on adjacent pages. Vesper read the file in a silence that had teeth in it. When she finally looked up, her voice had gone very quiet, which I would learn later was far more dangerous in her than volume. "They used you as camouflage." "Yes, and you found it anyway. Sitting in a room you didn't have to walk into, for a company that didn't have to hire you, auditing a fraud that had nothing to do with you until 11 days ago." Something moved behind her eyes, fierce and careful at once. "Do you understand what that says about you, Ren? That I'm thorough, that you are the only person in this building who has ever handed me a truth before I asked for it." She closed the file gently, like it deserved gentleness, even though its contents didn't. "This goes to my legal team in the morning, quietly, until we have enough to make it impossible for either of them to slip out from under it." I want your sister and your ex-wife to have no warning and no exit. Can you work on this without it destroying you first? I've been the one doing the destroying work my whole marriage, I said. This time, I get to do it on purpose. Something that was almost a smile crossed her face, brief as weather. Good, she said. Then, we start tomorrow. I should have felt only vindication, standing in that office with the proof in her hands and her voice steady on my behalf for the first time in longer than I could remember anyone's voice being steady on my behalf. Instead, what I felt, underneath the vindication, was the specific and terrifying warmth of being looked at by someone who had clearly decided I mattered before she had any obligation to. The exact opposite of 5 years of being useful and unseen. And I did not yet know that in 6 weeks that warmth would nearly get us both destroyed before it got us saved. The quiet build of those weeks felt, in hindsight, like the held breath before a held note breaks. Vesper's legal team moved with the patience of people who had done this before and understood that impatience is how the guilty slip free. I moved with the patience of someone who had spent a marriage learning to notice everything and say nothing, which turned out, uselessly, and then, usefully, to be excellent training for building an airtight case. We worked most nights until the building had gone dark around us except for our 2 offices, and somewhere in the 3rd week of that, without either of us naming it, dinner started arriving for 2 instead of 1, and neither of us questioned it out loud. The crisis that broke the surface tension came on a Thursday. At an industry gala Vesper was contractually required to attend, and I was not required to attend at all, except that Odera pulled me aside that afternoon with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Your sister's on the guest list, Odera said. +1. Guess who? I went. Not because I wanted to, but because some part of me understood that if I didn't walk into that ballroom on my own feet, I would spend the rest of my life flinching every time someone said Priya's name in a room I hadn't chosen to be in first. I saw them across the room before they saw me, Priya in green silk, unmarked throat on full display, and Dahlia beside her in a dress I recognized because I'd helped her buy it 3 years ago for someone else's wedding entirely. Priya's eyes found mine first. Something crossed her face that might have been shame if shame were a thing she'd ever practiced. Ren, she said my name like she still had a right to it. You look well. I am well, I said, and meant it more than I expected to. We should talk. There are some accounts that got tangled up in the divorce paperwork, some things that need signing off on my end. No, I said. There aren't, and something in my voice must have carried more certainty than she was braced for, because her smile faltered half a degree. Vesper arrived at my shoulder without seeming to hurry, the way weather arrives, and the temperature of the whole conversation changed before she said a single word. Miss Ashford Vane, she said, cool and immaculate. I don't believe we've had the pleasure. Vesper Cade, Priya's composure cracked exactly enough to be visible to someone who had spent 5 years learning to read her micro-expressions for a living. I didn't realize you and my ex-wife were acquainted, were colleagues, Vesper said, in a tone that made the words sound like an understatement she had chosen deliberately. Ren is the finest forensic mind I've had the privilege of working with in 15 years of running this company. I imagine that's not information you had access to, given how thoroughly you failed to notice it while she was married to you. Dahlia laughed, too bright. The sound of someone trying to diffuse a room she didn't understand was already lost. Ren's always been good with numbers, bit of a workaholic. Bit of a genius, Vesper corrected, mild as a knife. There's a difference, and I'd encourage you to learn it before you say her name again. I don't know what would have happened next if Odera hadn't materialized at that exact moment with a low word in Vesper's ear about a call that couldn't wait, but I know that Priya's hand found my wrist as I turned to go, quick and low, out of Vesper's earshot. "Whatever you think you're building with her," Priya said, quiet and venomous in the register she'd always used when she wanted something and didn't want witnesses, "you should know I still have friends on that board. Don't make me use them." "You should worry less about my future," I said, "and more about the 18 months of your past that I already have documented in more detail than you'd like to imagine." I didn't wait to watch her face change. I walked away before she could, which was, I understood, even as I did it, the first time in 5 years I had left a room before she gave me permission to. Vesper found me on the terrace 10 minutes later, the gala noise muffled behind glass, the city laid out below us in 1,000 small cold lights. "You didn't tell me you were planning to confront her tonight." "I didn't plan it. It happened." "Are you all right?" "I don't know yet." The honesty surprised me on the way out. I keep waiting to feel like I won something back there, and instead I just feel like I finally said a true thing out loud in front of her, which apparently isn't the same as winning, but it's close. Vesper was quiet a moment, her scent gone very still and cold, the way it did, I'd learned, when she was holding something in check. "She threatened you." I heard enough of it before Odera pulled me away. "She threatened the case." "Not me." "Same thing," Vesper said, low. "Tell me to stop if I'm wrong to say this now. Tonight, in the middle of all of it, she stopped herself. Some old discipline overriding whatever she'd been about to say, and I understood, watching her, that I was looking at a woman who had spent 3 years building a wall specifically so she would never again stand on a terrace wanting something enough to be afraid of losing it. "Say it," I said. "I have not wanted anything for myself in 3 years," Vesper said, quiet and exact, like a woman confessing to a crime. "Not since Elena. I built this whole company into something that couldn't need me to feel anything, because feeling things is how you end up standing in a hospital corridor at 4 in the morning, learning that love doesn't actually save anyone. It just makes the losing worse." And then you walked into my conference room with a folder full of numbers nobody else had bothered to read correctly, and I have wanted something for the first time in 3 years. And it terrifies me more than the board, more than the fraud, more than anything Priya Ashford Vane could possibly threaten me with. "Vesper, tell me to stop," she said again, closer now, her hand not quite touching my jaw, waiting, "and I will. I need you to know that. Whatever this is, it stops the second you ask it to." "Don't stop," I said, and the words came out steadier than my pulse had any business being. And when she kissed me, it was careful in a way that had nothing to do with hesitation, and everything to do with a woman handling something she'd already decided was worth not breaking. It lasted exactly as long as it lasted before her phone began to ring inside her jacket, insistent, and she pulled back with her forehead against mine, breathing like she'd been running. "Legal," she said, reading the screen, and her whole posture changed, cold flooding back into the set of her shoulders. "At this hour." That's never good news. It wasn't. Someone had leaked the Vane audit to a financial reporter 3 hours before Vesper's legal team was ready to move, and by morning, my name, not Priya's, not Dahlia's, mine, was attached to the story as a person of interest in an 18-month embezzlement scheme, because somebody, somewhere, had made very sure the leak arrived with my old signature on 3 of the adjacent authorization pages, and none of the context that explained why. The quiet weeks that followed the gala were the closest thing to peace I'd had since the anniversary, and I understand now that peace, in this story, was always borrowed time. Vesper's legal team spent 4 days containing the leak, 4 days in which I learned things about her I hadn't earned in the conference room, that she took her coffee black except on mornings after bad sleep. When she let herself have cream and didn't explain why, that she kept a single photograph of Elena on her desk, turned slightly away from visitors, not hidden, just private, that she had not cried in front of another person in 3 years, and told me so, one night, sitting on the floor of her study with her back against the desk and a glass of wine she wasn't drinking. She used to leave the porch light on, Vesper said, of Elena, without my asking, even when I was working late, even when there was no reason to expect me before midnight. She said a house should always look like someone's waiting up. After she died, I turned it off, told myself it was a waste of electricity. A small, humorless sound. It took me 2 years to understand I turned it off because I couldn't stand walking up to a lit porch and remembering there was no one behind the door waiting for me anymore. Is it on now? I asked. She looked at me a long moment. I turned it back on. On the week I hired you, she said. I don't fully know why. Call it instinct. I told her things too, that week, that I had never said out loud to anyone, not Talia, not the fairy house counselor, not even myself in the mirror. That I had married Priya partly because being chosen by someone powerful felt at 27 like proof I existed. That the reason I'd become so exactingly good with numbers was that numbers were the one place in my life that had never once lied to me or made me feel small for asking a careful question. That some nights, even now, I still reached across an empty bed out of 5 years of habit before I remembered there was no one there to reach for. There's someone there now, Vesper said, quiet if you want there to be. I want there to be, I said, and that was the night the careful distance between our 2 floors of the building finally, fully closed, slow and gentle and asked for at every single step, her mouth against my throat where no one had ever left a mark, her voice low and steady, asking, "Are you sure?" again and again, until I stopped needing to be asked and started answering with my hands instead of my words. The scent of her filled the room like weather breaking, cold flint gone warm at the edges, and mine, she told me later, half asleep, tracing the line of my collarbone like she was memorizing a map. Mine smelled like peach blossom and warm linen, like something that had been folded away clean for a long time and was finally being worn again. We were 3 days into that fragile new warmth when Odera knocked on the study door at 11 at night with a face I'd already learned to be afraid of. "You need to see this," she said, holding out a tablet. "Both of you." Now, the headline was worse than the leak. Priya, flanked by a lawyer and a publicist, had given an interview claiming that the entire embezzlement scheme was mine, that I had orchestrated the shell company using my sister's name without her knowledge, that I had manipulated the Vane accounts for years out of resentment over the marriage, and that I had only discovered the fraud at Kate Holdings in order to plant false evidence pointing away from myself. Dahlia, in the same piece, wept prettily for the camera about being manipulated by her own sister's obsession with money and control. It was a masterwork of exactly the kind of story a jealous, humiliated public loves to believe about a quiet woman who got too close to too much power too fast, and by the time I finished reading it, my hands had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. "They flipped it," I said. "They took the exact frame I was worried about from the beginning and built a whole narrative on top of it." "It won't hold," Vesper said, but her voice had an edge in it I hadn't heard before, controlled fury instead of controlled calm. "We have the transfer trail. We have dates. It doesn't have to hold forever," I said, numb. "It just has to hold long enough to cost you the board vote on the merger next month. It just has to make every investor in that room wonder if the woman running your fraud audit is the person who committed the fraud." "That's not a legal problem, Vesper. That's a story problem. and stories move faster than evidence. By morning, 2 board members had called for my consulting contract to be suspended pending review. By the following afternoon, a reporter was camped outside the building lobby with a photographer, and Pharaoh had to walk me in through the parking garage like I was something that needed hiding. Talia called from 3 states away, furious on my behalf, useless in the specific way that love is useless against a machine already in motion. I sat in my apartment 2 floors below Vespers that night and looked at the marmalade jar in the kitchen and felt, for the first time since the anniversary, the exact same cold, sick certainty I'd felt on the stairs outside my own bedroom, that I had built something good again. And it was about to be taken from me by people who had never built anything at all. I should resign the contract, I told Vesper, when she found me sitting in the dark instead of asleep. Before it costs you the merger. Before it costs you anything else. No, Vesper, I said no. Her voice cracked, just slightly, at the edges, the first time I'd heard it do that since the terrace. I have spent 3 years making sure nothing could be taken from me again by simply not having anything worth taking. I am not doing that this time. I am not letting them win by making you disappear quietly, Ren. That is exactly what they want, and I refuse to hand it to them. Then, what do? We do what you're good at, she said. We find the truth all the way down, and we make it impossible for anyone in that boardroom, in that press pool, in that entire city to look away from it. She took my face in both hands, cold flint and steady heat all at once. Tell me to stop being angry on your behalf, and I will try. Tell me to fight, and I will burn down every last thing they have left standing. Fight, I said, and meant it with everything left in me. I spent the next 4 days, barely sleeping, tracing the shell company's full transaction history back through every layer of obfuscation Priya and Dahlia had built, until the picture underneath was complete enough that no reporter, no board member, and no jury could mistake it for anything but what it was. A scheme that predated the affair by 6 months, meaning Dahlia had approached Priya first. Not the other way around, using the promise of the merger's private banking access as leverage before either of them had touched the other emotionally at all. The theft had come first. The betrayal of my marriage had been, in the ugliest possible sense, a business decision that happened to also be a personal one. I found the account where they'd been quietly moving the skimmed funds toward a property purchase in another country, dated for closing in 6 weeks. They had been planning to disappear the moment the merger closed, and the money was fully laundered through it. I brought all of it to Vesper at 2 a.m. on the 4th night, and she read it in a silence that had gone past anger into something colder and more absolute. They were going to run, she said. In 6 weeks. With everything. I heard my own voice go flat, the particular flatness of grief finally curdling into resolve. I want them stopped before they can. Not quietly. I want it in a room full of the same people who read that interview and believed it. Vesper looked at me a long moment, something fierce and careful moving behind her eyes. Then, we call an emergency shareholder session, she said. Vane Textiles fraud directly implicates Cade Holdings' supply chain integrity that gives us legal standing to convene it inside 72 hours. Every board member who suspended your contract will be in that room. Every reporter who ran that story will be outside it. Her hand found mine across the desk, steady as a held note. We do this together, in front of everyone, or we don't do it at all. Which do you want? Together, I said. In front of everyone. The morning of the shareholder session, Priya arrived expecting to defend a merger. I watched her face when she saw the projector screen come alive with the full transaction trail instead, the shell company, the transfer dates, the offshore property closing scheduled for 6 weeks out, and I watched something in her composure finally, completely break. 18 months of careful lies collapsing in real time in front of 40 witnesses, and 3 journalists who had, until that morning, printed every word she'd told them as fact. "This is fabricated," Priya said, too loud, too fast, the tell she'd never learned to hide. "She's had access to our systems for weeks. She could have built any of this. The transfer authorizations carry your signature, miss." "Ashford Vane," Vesper said, calm as winter water, dated 18 months ago, 6 months before any evidence of infidelity exists in the timeline. "Your sister-in-law's shell company was registered under her own name, using her own tax identification, a detail I doubt Miss Calloway fabricated, given that she would have had to forge a federal filing to do it." She let the silence sit a moment before she finished. "I have spent 15 years running this company on the principle that the truth, presented completely and without hysteria, is the only argument that survives a room like this one. Wren Calloway walked into my office 3 months ago with nothing but a folder and a talent nobody else had bothered to notice, and she has since done more to protect this company's integrity than anyone else on this floor. I suggest the board direct its questions to the people who built a theft on top of a marriage, not the woman who uncovered it." Dahlia, in the gallery, had gone the color of paper. Priya's lawyer was already on his phone. Someone near the back of the room, one of the 2 board members who had called for my suspension 4 days earlier, stood up and said quietly that he owed me an apology, and the room went very still around that sentence in a way I felt in my chest more than I heard with my ears. I stood up myself then, because some things a person has to say in her own voice, or they don't count. "I was married to Priya Ashford Vane for 5 years, I said, into a silence so complete I could hear my own pulse. "I kept her family's books because I was good at it, and because I loved her, or thought I did, which amounts to the same devotion at the time, even if it doesn't amount to the same thing looking back. I found this fraud by accident, doing an honest job for a company that had no reason to trust a stranger who walked in off the street. I would have found it regardless of who it implicated, because that is simply how I am built. I am not interested in revenge." I looked at Priya as I said the next part and let her see that I meant it. I am interested in the truth being the only thing left standing when this is over. Because the truth is, the one thing neither of you ever thought I'd be brave enough to hand to a room like this. The board voted to terminate Vane Textile's contract within the hour. Federal referral followed by the end of the week. Once the offshore transfers were flagged, Priya and Dahlia were both charged within the month. The property purchase seized before it ever closed. Every asset in the shell company frozen and returned, eventually, with interest, to Cade Holdings shareholders and to me. Vesper argued for the fullest possible prosecution in a closed-door session with the district attorney's office. I was the one, in the end, who asked her to let the process run its legal course, rather than use her own considerable leverage to make it worse than the law already would. "That's enough," I told her. That night, when she was still coiled tight with a fury that hadn't finished burning. "Let the law finish it. If we make this about crushing them instead of about the truth, we become the version of power that already ruined my marriage once. I don't want that for you. I don't want it for us." She exhaled slowly, some of the winter going out of her shoulders. "You're a better person than I am. I'm a person who's already lost enough to know what's worth keeping clean," I said. "Let them lose everything the legal way. That's already more than they ever gave me." Dahlia was sentenced to restitution and 3 years probation, her name quietly removed from every family document she'd ever hoped to inherit against. Priya received 18 months and a felony record that ended, permanently, any future in finance or family leadership. The Ashford Vane Board, in the fallout, voted her entirely out of the family trust, the very inheritance the theft had been built to protect. I did not attend either hearing. I sent nothing, said nothing, felt. When I heard the verdicts secondhand from O'Dara, a kind of quiet I hadn't expected. Not triumph, exactly, but the settling of a scale that had been tipped against me for a very long time finally coming level. 2 weeks after the sentencing, Vesper found me on the rooftop garden at dusk, in almost the exact spot where she'd first told me to bring her the truth before anyone else. She had something small in her closed hand, and she was, for the first time since I'd known her, visibly nervous, which undid me more than any grand declaration could have. "I had this made," she said, opening her palm to show me a fountain pen, deep sea blue, carved from a single piece of lacquered wood, my initials worked into the cap in letters so small I had to lean close to read them. "You told me once you signed your whole marriage away with a cheap hotel pen because it was the only one in the room. I didn't want the next thing you signed to be an afterthought." "What am I signing?" I asked, though something in my chest already knew. She got down on one knee on the rooftop stone, unhurried, entirely certain, the winter widow of Cade Tower kneeling in front of a woman who 3 months earlier had walked in off the street with nothing but a folder and a stubborn refusal to look away from a column of numbers that didn't add up. "Marry me," Vesper said. "Bond with me, if you want that too, in your own time, on your own terms. I will wait as long as you need. I have learned the hard way what it costs to rush a bond that should be chosen freely. But marry me. Let the last thing you sign with a pen from someone who loves you be a life instead of a surrender." "Ask me properly," I said, laughing and crying at the same time, because some part of me needed to hear the whole shape of it. "Wren Calloway," she said, steady as a held note finally resolving. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," I said, and when she rose and kissed me, the city went on beneath us exactly as it had the first cold night I'd stood up here unable to sleep, except that everything about how it felt to stand there had changed completely. We were married in early spring, in the same rooftop garden, small and warm and entirely unlike the wedding I'd had before. No merger disguised as a marriage, no family alliance dressed up in white, just Talia crying openly in the second row, O'Dara standing gruff and misty-eyed at Vesper's shoulder as the closest thing she had to family, and Vesper's mother Ilsa. Arriving 3 days before the ceremony specifically, she said, to see for herself the woman who had apparently taught her daughter that control and strength were not, in fact, the same thing. 15 years I watched her build walls instead of a life. Ilsa told me quietly, the morning of the wedding, watching Vesper across the garden directing florists with the same exacting calm she brought to a boardroom. I taught her that doctrine myself, God forgive me, thinking I was arming her. I have never once seen her wait for anyone the way she waits for you to finish a sentence before she answers it. Whatever you did, keep doing it. We bonded that night, after the ceremony, in the quiet of our own bedroom, instead of in front of any witness at all. Because some things are for exactly 2 people, and no one else, her mouth at my throat, asking one final time with words instead of teeth, "Are you sure?" And my answer, the only one I had left to give her, "Don't stop." The bite settled warm instead of sharp, and the bond that opened between us afterward felt less like a change, and more like a door I hadn't known was there finally swinging open onto a room that had been waiting, furnished, and lit for as long as I'd been walking past it without knowing. A year on, the porch light at our country house stays lit every night, whether either of us is expected before midnight or not, because Vesper says a house should always look like someone's waiting up, and this time she means it as a promise instead of a habit she's afraid to keep. The lavender she planted along the garden wall the autumn after the wedding, because I'd mentioned once, half asleep, wanting one since childhood, is tall enough now to bend in the evening wind. Burnt edge toast with orange marmalade still arrives most mornings, and neither of us ever mentions out loud that it's arranged. Because some kindnesses are better left unspoken, so they can keep being kindnesses instead of becoming performances. The blue fountain pen sits in a drawer in my study, capped and full, waiting for whatever the next true thing worth signing turns out to be. I think sometimes about the stare I stood on the night everything ended, the half-second before the lock gave, and my whole understanding of my life rearranged itself around a sound I hadn't wanted to hear. I have decided, finally, that the stare wasn't where I lost anything at all. It was where I stopped being someone's quiet convenience and started, slowly, becoming someone's whole and chosen life. It wasn't kindness that saved me. It was being seen, fully, by someone who had finally decided that looking was worth the risk of losing again. And it turns out a person can be devalued for a very long time and still, given one honest reader of the right column of numbers, be found. The end.